All right, we are live for our third episode of the Girl Develop It podcast. As always, if you don't know me yet, my name is Jessica, and I am a software engineer, a developer educator, and a tech community organizer. I'm so excited for us to be talking about this one topic today. So I want to get right into it, which is the importance of testing in software development. So, for our episode today, we have Pamela Fox. She is one of our beloved community members, and I'm going to let her introduce herself and give you a little bit of her background if you have not heard from or learned from Pamela yet.
Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here. Thank you. And what is my background? I have been programming for a very long time, and I've done a range of jobs. I'm currently at Microsoft, where I am a developer advocate, and I work with Python communities and helping them, put their Python programs in the cloud, in the Microsoft cloud. And before that, I've worked at Coursera, Khan Academy. I created most of the computer programming curriculum for Khan Academy, and I've taught quite a few workshops for Girl Develop It. My first job was at Google, also doing developer advocacy, but for the Maps API. I've worked at it on a chatbot. And yeah, so I've done a variety of jobs. I also was a lecturer at UC Berkeley. So I kind of alternate between software engineering, teaching, and advocacy, because they're all like, I just like the mix of programming and roles, something new.
Awesome. So, for one, I don't think I realized that you did a lot of the Khan Academy curriculum, so that's interesting to me for sure. I know you've done so much teaching, and everything, and of course, we have you teaching a lot of the Python materials, different types of workshops with Girl Develop It. And so earlier this year, maybe it was a few months back now, we kind of came up with this idea of having this episode because we noticed and this is something we always notice with Girl Develop It, right? Certain classes are more popular than others, and we always try to figure out why. And so it was very interesting because it's like you've been teaching this long series, but then the one class that tends to be like underattended is the testing workshop. So I was wondering if you wanted to kind of like speak a little bit to that and what you think may even be contributing to that.
Yeah. It was definitely the lower attendance, and it was the first time I was giving that workshop, and so that was interesting to see. So I don't know, it could have been a fluke, but I think there probably is a perception that testing is, like a nice to have skill versus like like a crucial skill, right? Like the probably the skills people are looking for, the things like the kind of the buzzwords on your resume, right? Like, oh, I know how to use Docker and Kubernetes and stuff like that. Those sort of workshops have been fairly popular. But maybe testing isn't something that people feel is going to add to their resume. That might be part of it. People might also think that testing's not relevant to maybe the projects they're doing, their code they're doing. I think it's relevant to everything that people are doing. So yeah, I think there could be multiple reasons. We're gonna offer it again in about a month, I think, is when it's happening. So we'll see what the turnout is like this time. Hopefully with this podcast, we'll see more turnout.
Yeah, and so for me, I was thinking about that too. I do teach a lot for coding boot camps and always have over my career, and I feel like it's one of those things that we gloss over because of course it's only, you might have 3 months, 6 months in a boot camp and you can only learn so much and only teach so much. But I feel like the fact that we don't spend a lot of time on it maybe even contributes to a lot of folks that are going through that avenue kind of being like, well, maybe it's
Mm,
not it's like you said, it's more of a nice to have versus it being an essential skill. And it's funny for me because I didn't even though we were getting exposure to testing and I felt like I was going out of my way to try to learn it initially, I didn't really know what testing was until like I worked in a team where we did heavy
mm,
testing. So,
mhm.
we'll kinda get into that as well, like what was your experience like when you started? But how would you define testing in software? What does that mean to you?
I mean, there's actually lots of kinds of tests you can run against your code. But I think a lot of times when we use the word test generically, we're talking about trying to see, does our code work correctly according to our specification, right?
Mhm.
Which is somewhat subjective because one app might expect their code to work in a different way than another one, but that's why you have to have a specification, you have to have an idea of how it works. So most of the times
Right.
when we say the word test, we're like, does this work according to the way we want it to work? But there are also lots of other kinds of things you can test. Like you can test to see that you can kind of test your performance. Like you can test performance regression and see like, is my code still performing as well as I, expected it would? You can do accessibility testing to test to see if your website's accessible.
Uh-oh, did
All
I
kinds of
lose
tests are
you?
do. Oh, yeah,
Okay, you were
I
saying,
think I lost you
if
for a
it
sec.
was accessible, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So you can test for stuff accessible. So there's all kinds of different quality assurance you can do. But most of the times when we do talk tests, we're checking that a code is working as we want it to work.
Right, right. So it's funny you mentioned a couple things. I like I said, for me when I first got started, I thought I knew what testing was. I thought I went out of my way to try and showcase testing, even in some of the first jobs. One of the first jobs I actually got, my first software engineering role was. Not only did I write the code for they give you a code challenge and I actually submitted my code challenge, but I also wrote test cases for my code as well. Like, I felt like I was doing all the things. But then, that was like more of my first experience where we talked about it, but we also used to do coding retreats for folks that were in boot camp. So then, you would have the red, green test exercises and be able to kind of like work through those. So I was like, yeah, I know what tests are. I think my idea was of tests were what we call unit tests
Mhm.
specifically. And it's funny that you even mentioned the idea of like, you can test your whole system, right? So I got into an environment where I found out what a canary test was and a unit test
Mhm.
and the integration test and like a lot of it. And that was because I went into a TDD environment or test driven development for folks that aren't familiar with that term. And so in that case, in the past before, all the experiences I had with testing were write your code, you know, f functionally tested, try to see if anything works, you're actually physically testing to see that things are working the way you expect them to, and then maybe you write some unit tests afterwards to actually test the code and see does the code work the way you expected it to, and that was completely flipped on its head when I went to a TDD environment where it was like, testing is not an option. You don't write code until you write a test. So, therefore, if you don't know how to write the test, then you won't be writing any code. But it was a pair programming environment as well, a
Mm.
very heavy pairing culture. So I learned so much like very quickly about the entire scope of testing and how big it could really be. And how complicated it can be to get into testing. So, I don't know if you have like a similar experience. Was like your first testing experience and like when it finally stuck, were those the same thing or were those different experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I can actually remember, my first test. I don't think we wrote very many tests in college, and that was actually, there was a tweet that went around a few weeks ago where somebody observed, like, why didn't I learn testing in college? And it's interesting because when I taught at UC Berkeley, we started off with tests. Like, you had
Mm.
the whole semester, you just had to get those tests to pass, and that's because we had to, because our Berkeley class was 2,000 students, so we
Right.
needed tests so that they would get that feedback that, oh, your test, your code is working or not working. When you have a small number of students, like, you can check their code, but when you're teaching at scale, you need some form of tests to give students feedback. So we definitely did have testing in our curriculum there. But yeah, I don't remember if I had it in college. I think my, like, one of my earlier memories around tests was when I was at Coursera, and I was one of the early engineers. And when we started off, we did not have any tests at all in our code base. And our code base was like a mix of like PHP and JavaScript. It was
Interesting.
interesting, yeah. And so yeah, so when we wrote lots and lots of code, because we were making lots and lots of features, and it was very exciting because this is when Coursera was just starting up. And but then there was sometimes we introduced bugs, and I remember the first bug, and it was like a pretty nasty bug, and we're having a meeting afterwards about it. And I remember a colleague saying, like, well, I think we should just write smarter code. I was like, smarter code, smarter code, okay. How about we write tests? Because yeah, we can try to like stare at our code and think about whether it's correct, and that's good to do as well. But a really good way of thinking about that is by writing a test, right? And
Right,
that
right.
really, like, once you write a test, like, it's a really nice way of thinking through what your code expects, what are the edge cases, what is it supposed to return, what situation is supposed to work in. So I managed to convince everyone to write tests, and that's when we started writing lots and lots of tests. And
Okay.
I think we were writing kind of unit level tests, kind of a mix of like unit and integration, for both Python and JavaScript.
That's really cool because, like you said, it's like people think like, "Oh, I can just write smarter code. I can just be smarter." And it's like, no matter how smart you are, you can't really predict every single thing. You're not always like we are not perfect. Like software developers make mistakes all the time. So just assuming that we're going to be perfect doesn't even really make much sense to me. And testing is a way to kind of have more of a support system in our development process, right? So for me, I remember that one of the biggest things at first was really hard for me in the TDD environment because again, it wasn't an option anymore. So it was like I had to kind of flip my thought process. But then it became even easier to write code after I learned how to do TDD. And
Mhm.
for me, it was easier because I never had that overwhelming fear that I was going to break something like I
Mhm,
always
mhm.
had before. And I was on this was like me moving to a big high tech company. And there was a lot riding on if the service goes down, if something doesn't work, you're costing the company tens of thousands, maybe
Right.
even hundreds of thousands of dollars for downtime. Um, and so just knowing that, hey, whatever tests we already wrote are already covering any code that we've already written because of our testing methodology. So if I write a line of code and it breaks something, I'm going to know instantly. And that
Mhm.
just like once I got comfortable with that, it made me feel a lot more free and in that environment and even released a lot of weight to just learn and experiment and not feel so much pressure. So it's very interesting because I wasn't expecting to get that type of experience out of like test driven development in particular.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point. And I think maybe part of the reason that I got so into testing is because when I was at Google, I would read like all the postmortems, which would happen like after an outage. And I was actually on call when a really, really bad outage happened.
Mhm.
And it took down like Google Docs, anything where you were like writing documents in Google's cloud, it took it down. And it took it down for like an hour or more, which is actually like a big deal, right, at Google level. And in the postmortem was, basically like all postmortems almost always include something like we didn't have enough tests, right? Like they had
Right.
no tests of this particular code, and it was a Python for loop that just had to reverse the key values of iterating through a dictionary. That was it. That's what took down Google. right? And but we just didn't have the test for it.
Yeah, I know it's very interesting. It's like it's not a perfect way to do it necessarily. I think okay, maybe we can talk a little bit about it, but we're kind of getting into why it's important, but also why we choose not to or kind of go the route of avoiding tests. Like obviously in the TDD environment that I was in, testing was mandatory. But then pretty much like you said, we've been in situations where we have all this code and we have no tests, and why don't people write tests? Like, if it's gonna help us in the long term, why do we cut it out of the process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's the thing. Testing can be hard to set up. If you have no tests yet in a code base, it can be difficult to set up, especially if if you're developing a web app. In order to write a test, like if you're trying to test the routes in the web app, you do need to like fake out aspects of that web app, right? You need to have like a fake
Mhm.
local server running. You need to like have your fake test database. So there's a lot to fake out, which is why I'm like putting particularly effort into right now. And all the samples we're making for, for Microsoft is we're succeeding all of them with tests, and so they've all got like that initial thing set up. Because once you get it, once you have those initial tests, it is so much easier to write the rest of the tests. But that's why I do think it's really important to start off with at least some tests, and that can really lower the barrier for other people on your team in contributing tests. It sucks to be the first one to set up the tests, but
Yes,
it's
yes.
worth it. It's worth it in the end because then you can get that confidence that you can write new code and not have it break everything.
That's such a good point because I think that's what I was experiencing when I first was getting into that TDD environment, right? It was like we have microservices and they all have to talk to each other and we have to mock certain things and like you said, have fake data for the database and having a like the testing
Mhm.
environment itself can be really, really, really complicated when you don't have that experience yet. And you know what I experienced or what I feel like I witnessed was that it's so much work on the front end to get it done that it seems like it's slowing down the process versus once you
Mhm.
actually realize you have bugs in your code or once like you said you have a big outage or something like that, then now you have to deal with the consequences of that on the back end. And a lot of times especially in those I've been in a lot of startup environments, so it's just like go, 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 try to get everything to prod as quickly as possible, and unfortunately, we suffer on the back end of it because we move so fast to the point where now we have to go back and try to find the bugs, and it's so hard to find it after the fact.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's I mean, interesting to note is that there's kind of a movement lately towards starting with integration tests, and that
Okay.
might be the thing to do for folks who are like, "Oh my gosh, we have so much code, none of it is tested. It would take us forever to unit test this." Um, maybe starting with an integration test or an end-to-end test, right? So if you're in a web app, being able to hit up your homepage and checking that your homepage loads and you can click a button, that's an end-to-end test, and you can do that using Selenium, and you can do that using Playwright, and you can do that for many languages, and that'll actually end up like hitting up a lot of parts of your code when you do have a end-to-end test. There's a movement now to start with end-to-end tests, and that's actually what we've started doing for our Python on Azure samples. And then when you need them, when you have the time, you can add unit tests for particularly pieces of code that have some tricky logic in them in particular. I think I lost Ezekiel, so uh, I'll just keep going. um, so yeah, I mean, talking about end-to-end tests. Oh, here we go. Hi.
I'm back. I think the internet is very weird here, but
Okay.
I saw you were still going.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I finished up just talking about starting with end-to-end testing.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. And again, so what one thing I'm planning on doing this year, obviously you have your workshop coming up. I was in the month of December, I'm planning on doing like a pairing, like a series where we do pair programming and testing, and then kind of doing an actual code retreat, which I haven't done in a really, really long time. And there's like this official kind of like idea of a code retreat, and you can kind of look up resources for it online. But I really love like having those environments. But I also noticed like, we started with unit tests, and unit tests are it's fine. But when I got into that environment where I actually really needed to know how to test, it wasn't a unit test that I started with. A lot of times it was, hey, our service has to talk to the service that does authentication and authorization before we can even write our code. So maybe there's a lot more of like exposure that we can do to some of the other forms of testing besides just
Mhm.
unit, and what that really means.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, we're doing a lot of playwright, putting playwright in our code lately. Because playwright is like similar to Selenium for end-to-end testing, and um and that's really helpful. But you will have to like mock stuff out sometimes, right?
Hmm.
So depending on what it is you're trying to test. So like right now we're figuring out how to test our OpenAI chat on your data samples, and that's pretty tricky because we've got OpenAI calls, we've got Azure Cognitive Search calls,
Yeah.
we've got authentication calls, right? So we have to mock out all of those, and there's a lot of different ways that you can mock these things out, and there's lots of debates about different ways to mock. Like I read a blog post yesterday that was really good, which was like 10 different ways that you could mock out these sorts of API calls, and the
Okay.
pros and cons for each one. I'll share that one in the chat because that was just really, really good.
Definitely. So, maybe we covered it a bit, but if we wanted to like highlight in some points why testing is important, like what kind of value is it bringing to us as developers?
Um, yeah. I mean, so what I find, what I find is if I start writing tests in an existing code base, I start finding bugs immediately, right? And I'm like, oh, great, glad we have these tests. And that's also how, there was a comment about, business doesn't see immediate value.
Mhm.
Because a lot of times people think like, oh, they've got good code. But I was very happy yesterday because I've been trying to encourage folks to write more tests for our samples, because the samples don't tend to come with tests as much, because the samples are like, oh, look how this thing works, right?
Right.
And they're supposed to be starting off points, but lots of people like start off and then they'll keep going and it won't have any tests, right? So I want our starting off points for Microsoft Azure, I want them all to be tested, and so that people can keep adding their own tests to it, right? I want to start everybody off on a good foot. So an engineer was like writing tests for their new feature yesterday and was like, oh my gosh, I already found bugs, I'm sold. So I was so happy to hear that, right? So yeah, it'll find bugs in our code. For me, it's having the confidence to be able to go to sleep at night, right? When I was young and didn't have a family and didn't have little babies, sure, I could wake up in the middle of the night, get called, be on page and fix something and do like an emergency deploy of the server, and it's very exciting. And I've like deployed servers in a taxi and stuff, but now
Oh.
I'm like, I'm old and I've got kids and I need to be able to sleep at night. So I want the confidence that I can, go to bed and that I can wake up and then nothing will have broken in the meantime. And it also allows us to, but I also do like iterating. I like to add
Mhm.
new features. I like to keep improving things, but I can't do that if I don't have tests. And I also like to refactor. I'm definitely a refactor, kind of person who likes refactoring things, because I'm like, oh, this thing, it's so, it's not very clean.
Yeah.
Um, but with tests also enable me to be able to refactor more, right?
I think I agree with all those points. And like I was mentioning, for me, it was definitely a different world when I was just in such a high pressure environment, because unlike how you described your on call experiences, I found it to be very extremely anxiety inducing to get paged at 3 a.m. And the way our structure worked, there was like primary gets paged, then secondary gets paged 5 minutes later if you don't answer, then uh engineering director gets paged. So it like skips up really quickly after the team, then the engineering director gets paged, and then after that the VP of engineering gets paged. So in like 20 minutes, regardless of whether, you are getting it together or not, pretty much all eyes are on you, and it's 3 a.m. and you're like, what is even happening? And just trying to figure out everything that's going on. So I actually had a funny story where when I went and got my, like, I had knee surgery. I had tore my ACL, and when I came back, when I finally got put back in the on-call rotation, I kid you not, I literally got paged, like, every time I was on call for, like, a year. Like, nobody else got paged. It just so happens that every time I get paged, we're on call. So it's like, I really enjoyed the fact that knowing that we had our tests, it didn't, like I said, didn't put so much pressure on me from the day to day of being like, "Oh, shoot, if I break this one little thing, I know I'm getting paid this time." Like, so that was that was just it's just, I think that was an unspoken kinda, like, value that I definitely was able to experience, and I was in an environment, I think, in that case where there was a lot of imposter syndrome, there was a lot of potential to feel like, "Okay, everybody else is a lot more experienced than me, everybody else has a different background than me," and just being able to feel comfortable to, you know, code freely, actually changed my whole entire learning experience and being able to interact on a team setting. So that's like my biggest one. Obviously, we have like the specifics about it, but I appreciate, like, it's almost hard for me now. I'm like, I have to get back to writing more tests because I like the TDD framework personally. But I know not everybody takes that approach, and I think that's good. But I can't really imagine a world now where I'm just like, oh, TDD, why would you ever want to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's comments about, the discipline that, in order to write the tests, and, yeah, definitely when you're writing a regression test, so when you're fixing a bug, regression tests are really, really helpful. But then, like, the follow-up comment about the discipline is harder the more you know a code base, and
Hmm.
maybe because your assumption is like, "Well, I know this code base, I know it's not gonna break." Um, but what you can do in that case, actually, what you can do in all cases is bring in a coverage tool. So
Hmm. Hmm.
whenever I have, like PyTest in like a Python code base, I'm always bringing in coverage and PyTest Cov, and that shows. And so I can specifically test and see, I can specifically see, like that line of code that I added is a, one that's not tested. And you can even fail your CI if your coverage has gone down past a certain amount. So in some of my repos, like the ones where I have 100% test coverage, I fail if the coverage goes under 100%. And yeah, 100% is hard to get to. These are like very tiny repos. But you can do that, like, but you can do things like that. So that helps you with the discipline, because I know that when I have CI/CD, I always want to make those checks green. I am very motivated by getting checks to be green on my, GitHub action workflows, right?
Yeah, and I think in my experience, I had a team where we actually had a dedicated tools team, so all they did was write those CI/CD, integrations and write different tooling and things so that would catch us. We wouldn't even be able to merge a PR if your test coverage wasn't either where it needed to be, or you went in and specifically manually said, "Okay, hey, I wanna ignore this thing or that thing." So, we just had, like, a lot of guardrails on, in a very high tech environment, very, very smart folks, but I think the team was smart enough to understand that we can't lean on our own expertise. We really need to have some tooling in play, just to make sure that, we're minimizing downtime as much as possible, minimizing, the risk that we introduce into the system over time. So I'm glad you're like bringing up some of those other buzzwords again, because I feel like we just don't talk about it a lot earlier on in the software development process if you're learning or getting into the
Mhm.
field. But such a valuable skill.
Yeah, I think I got a bit spoiled from being at Google, because Google had a very strong testing culture, at least when I was there from 2006 to 2011. Like, you go to the bathroom and there are posters on the stalls that say testing on the toilet. And it would just be like a tip on how to test something, like here's how to box, a particular thing. So Yeah, the testing would just follow you throughout the building. So we did have a strong testing culture there, and as someone mentioned, like you can even have like engineers, engineering teams, test engineers. That's what Google had, was
Mhm,
software
mhm.
engineering test, and those folks would actually specifically work on testing tools. And that's amazing. Like if you have a large enough company that you have people that can improve your testing tools, that's really really cool, and it also shows that the company actually has an investment in that.
Yeah, definitely. I think, for us, we were like now this was interesting to me. I didn't necessarily agree with this sentiment, but I definitely saw this in our TDD environment where some people were like, "We don't need QA because we are very, very religious about our TDD. So therefore,
Mm.
there's no reason to test on the back end." I'm not sure that I think that that's the right approach either. But do you have thoughts about that?
So when they said they don't need QA, are they saying they don't need a manual QA team? Is
Yeah,
that what
the
they were
we don't
saying?
need a testing team, all we need is TDD. So, because I cannot write any code without writing a test for it first, therefore,
Mm,
there is no need to have someone come in on the back end and further, like, test out the code or write tests. We also had other things like test coverage tools,
okay.
probably anything you can name in the tech stack to kind of try to eliminate that. We had canary services and monitors and
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
all the good stuff.
Well, I mean, it's so interesting because when people say QA can mean a lot of things because sometimes QA means a manual QA team. Like we had a manual QA team at Khan Academy. That was actually really great because they also would
Mhm.
look for accessibility issues because you can only automatically check for like 56% of accessibility issues, right? So they would do both use like testing the software, the web app works, but also testing accessibility and usability at the same time.
Right.
And you can't get all of that out of an automated test. So I think when you can afford manual QA, it's really cool because they'll just notice things, right? I mean, all software has bugs. So if you get someone to try out your code, they're gonna find bugs in it. And QA teams can be like really, really conscientious, like really good at noticing things. But in terms of like, having an additional QA team that writes tests, if you're already writing tests, I think that I guess I would agree with them that probably you don't need to have additional someone writing tests. If you had an additional resource, they might be working on like making your tests run faster.
Mhm.
That sort of thing. Like so more meta tools, more high level tools, um, but not actually writing the tests.
Right. I think I view the sentiment as like I understand where they're coming from, but I'm like, like I think was mentioned before, you when you know the code and you know what it's supposed to do, you tend to have certain biases around how things work and how you think things work versus bringing in an outside team that doesn't have any assumptions. And for us, we were building developer facing tools.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of gaps that probably wouldn't actually be more of a testing. It's not a logical gap, but it's more so how are people actually interacting with this tool?
Mm, mhm, mhm.
And because they do run into issues eventually. They always run into issues. And maybe some of that could be solved, like you said, with more of a team that comes in and actually they are interacting with the service as well. And so they have a different perspective to bring to the table versus the people who sat down and actually wrote all the services and know how
Yeah.
they're supposed to work.
Right. So that's true. So that actually brings up a good point that I wanted to name drop property-based testing. So property-based
Okay.
testing is the idea that if you have a function, you have an API, and if the function takes integers, you set up property-based testing, and it will throw a bunch of integers at it. It'll throw very large integers. It'll throw negative integers. It'll throw zero at it. So it tries to throw a bunch of possible values and including like common corner cases, right? Like maybe you
Right.
didn't consider how a negative number would work. So that's the idea of property-based testing, and it works not just for integers, it works for strings, it works for APIs. There's a specific version just for fast API, which is really cool. That's a way of finding your blind spots, realizing like, oh, okay, this was a bit of code where I forgot to write a test for this thing. So I think we like, I start with the tests that I manually write, but if I'm in a situation where I can use property based testing, so in Python that's usually using hypothesis or schema thesis. then I do try to use it. It can be maybe tricky sometimes to do, but almost every time I've used it, I have found some interesting issues arise from it.
Yeah.
And that's very common for APIs. Definitely, if you're building a developer-facing API, you can use a tool that'll do like property-based testing and throw lots of things at it, to try and guess how other users are going to use it.
That's really cool. I hadn't heard of that before, so I definitely wrote that on my sticky notes. And so I guess I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about with the workshop series that you have been doing with us throughout the year. How is that framed? And especially with the testing, like what kind of approach are you taking to folks just kind of learning more about testing since usually that's probably their first experience?
Yeah, good question. So I'll be teaching the Python for web app series, and so that's I think we've got 4 or 5 workshops. So we start off with Flask, then we do Django, then we do Fast API, then we do containerizing, and then our final workshop will be about testing web apps. So that's the approach we're taking here. We could have also like done testing along the way too, because each of the repos we'll be working on do have tests in them as well. But testing is like enough of a standalone topic that if you haven't done it before, it's good to get started. So yeah, in testing web apps, actually, so last time we gave it, called it just testing. But this time we're calling it testing web apps with the hope that that'll motivate people more to think like, oh, testing web app, that's interesting. Maybe I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully, it motivates
Yeah.
people to think about that as a specific skill, especially coming off the rest of the workshops. And the other reason to like focusing on testing web apps is because it is harder, right? Like, we might feel comfortable writing a unit test for a simple function that has an input and output, but
Mm-hmm.
how do we test an API? How do we test a front end? How do we set up all these fake servers and fixtures and all that stuff? So yeah, so that's what we'll end up talking about, and that way, we'll really get into the nitty gritty details.
Awesome. I'm going to put the link to so this is gonna go straight to our Python, page in particular on the Girl Develop It site. However, you can, I'll bring it up briefly because we do have screen share when in our lovely little world of, doing online podcasts. But yes, we have there's quite a few classes in the series, so, I highly encourage you all if you are interested to definitely jump in on those. Obviously, of course, we think Pamela's amazing, and you've had a couple times to do this series over the last year. So we start out with Python web apps. Here, I'm going to bring this up. Python. I have the joy of not having multiple screens set up right now, but it's all good. Share just a window. Okay, here we go. So on our Python landing page here on the Girl Develop It site, this one just actually shows you all the classes we have up and coming for this particular track. So you could
Mhm.
actually jump into the Python web apps, which is starting next week on the 27th. Then it's going to have Python web apps with databases. So just kind of extending on to the knowledge as we go further. Then we have building HTTP APIs with Python Fast API. That one's on October 11th. And then afterwards, containerizing Python web apps is on October 18th. And then finally, on October 25th, we have testing web apps in Python. So yeah, I'm excited. I'll have to actually sit in this time because I want to kind of walk through the material as well. I feel like a lot of stuff you covered was really, really great last time.
Yay.
All right. Let's see. Okay, let me come back. Okay, so I know we have kind of gotten into most of the things that we wanted to kind of hit on. Was there any other topics you feel like we could cover, or is something that you definitely want people to think about when it comes to testing?
Yeah, just looking at my notes. I mean, one reason I'm getting like increasingly passionate about encouraging testing is because we are seeing, increasing usage of LLMs, like GitHub Copilot and ChatGPT to generate code. And I'm using them myself. I use GitHub Copilot quite a lot, and it's really, really helpful. But anytime we're using, like, code that someone else wrote, whether it's from an LLM or from Stack Overflow or wherever, a tutorial, we probably haven't thought through that code as much.
Mhm.
And it's very, very possible, very likely that it doesn't cover all the edge cases that our code needs to cover.
Right.
So, particularly in the age of LLMs and community resources, I think it's really important to encourage testing, because I think
Mhm.
we can be really productive, with all these tools, and these tools can even help us write the tests. They're actually really good at writing tests. I Copilot like found a bug in my code when I had it write some tests, because it thought of something I hadn't thought of. So yeah, so I think we can definitely use these tools to help us write more productive code. But remember, when we're gonna be most productive is when we don't have to wake up at 3 a.m. and fix bugs, right? So let's be more,
Definitely.
let's be super productive, but then let's also think about how we can verify that, is the code true, right? We know, like, LLMs have a track record of confabulating things, because they just predict stuff, and sometimes what they predict isn't correct. A lot of times it is, but sometimes it's not. So how do we know that the thing it came up with is correct? Well, we need to do some sort of testing.
Right.
So I do think it's particularly important to be using testing, to be using linters. So linters this isn't a linting podcast, but also linting is really important, because linting can check for common style issues, right? Linting doesn't just check for, like, outright errors. It can also check for common style issues, things like ambiguous things that can lead to errors. So I always, on my Python code, I'm always running rough, with the iSort and PyUpgrade baked in. So it's also like looking for things I can upgrade in my code. So there's all kinds of linters that you can use to see, is my code following the best practices of this particular, language. So yeah, just want to say, like, that's why I think it's getting particularly, I'm excited. I am really excited about LLMs. I actually work a lot, like, all day on LLMs. All my tabs right now are just my GPT debugging tabs right now. Um, but uh, but I also want to make sure that the code we're writing is working.
I agree. I love that, and, anybody that has been following me knows that's LLMs in particular are my obsession right now. I've always liked NLP, so obviously, or natural
Yeah.
language processing for folks that don't know all the acronyms, but, ever since obviously we have all these big LLMs surfacing, that's all we really talk about on my live streams and stuff. So, yeah, but it's interesting to start to think about. I think about the research side of it. So I think about how are we solving problems or introducing new types of capabilities into the systems? And I think we talk a lot about coding, but I haven't heard people talking as much about, like, directly investing in the testing features that these LLMs have. So that gives me more to dig into as well.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, just talking about, like, different types of tests. Today, like, what I'm actually working on after this podcast is that I'm working on testing our ChatGPT plus cognitive search app, testing the quality of its output. So that's, again,
Mhm.
like, now in the age of LLM apps, this is another kind of testing, which is checking to see if the answers are, checking the metrics. So we look at metrics like, it's called groundedness, fluency, coherence, relevance. Those are a bunch of the metrics we'll be looking at. So that's going to be really interesting. So I have, like, test data, which is like, this is like, what we expect the answer to do, and then we tell it to evaluate, and then it actually uses GPT-4. If you have GPT-4, it's best to use GPT-4 to evaluate. And so GPT-4 will evaluate the answers against, the ground truth answers versus what it gets
Okay.
from the LLM, and then it will assign it scores. And so what I'm really excited about this is that then when we get pull requests to our ChatGPT plus cognitive search repo, and the pull requests are trying to change the prompt, because lots of people do play around with our prompt and kind of like our prompting flow, and they say, like, oh, this one works better. It's like, well, maybe it worked better for the test
That's
you
what
did. Does it
right.
work better overall. So we need to be able to answer that question. This is another form of quality, quality assurance. And this is something that can give us confidence that as we change the prompt, as we upgrade it, that it actually is increasing, the groundedness and fluency and all of that of our answers. So I think this is really interesting, and this is what I'll be digging into today.
Awesome. Well, I have to kind of figure out a ways to follow up on things that you're doing. So let us know, Pamela, how can folks connect with you online? Any special like projects you have, especially outside of girl development classes?
Yeah. So how to connect with online? It's hard to say these days because the social media stuff keeps changing. But I am still on Twitter, kind of at Pamela Fox on Twitter. I'm more on Mastodons, so I'm Pamela Fox at fostodon.org. And then I'm also on LinkedIn. You search for me on LinkedIn. And but generally I have a blog, and I try to
Okay.
put stuff on the blog. So my most recent posts are all about ChatGPT apps. So I try to share whenever I do gain knowledge. I try to share that knowledge because I feel bad hoarding knowledge. So do check out my blog, blog.pamelafox.org, linked from my website, www.pamelafox.org. And I try to post things there. I have like a list of blog posts that I like want to write. So I haven't written everything out there. There's a billion blog posts I wish I could write. But I will try to share things there when I can.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. I'm in a similar boat right now. Just been finally relaunching my blog and putting up classes and stuff. So I will definitely be taking a look and seeing what you have posted. Also, I know the I have a wall of stickies. It's like all these things staring at my face, but yeah, so we will definitely be happy to hear more from you, Pamela. And for me, if you all are interested, I am at MetaDev Girl pretty much everywhere, metadevgirl.com. And I will see you all pretty much every Thursday, as I always do. So we'll go ahead and wrap up the episode for today. And be sure to go ahead and visit girldevelopit.com. You can check out our Python classes. We also have JavaScript classes and other events that you can, use to just kind of build out your skill set as you're growing in software development. So happy you all could join us today, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye, everyone.